All right, welcome to Collateral Banter episode 25. That's right. Can't believe I'm there already. It is going to be an episode on oil and politics again. Let me start off with saying this episode's about Britain and Libya and the corruption involved there. Politicians, we know, lie. The lie obscures what they actually do behind the scenes. What happens in public, or what we know in the media, is manipulated, controlled. We get the information politicians want us to get. However, in recent years, especially with the internet, people can now use information. People can now discover details of reports, of leaks, of documents being released about what goes on behind the scenes. We begin to see the operations of politics, of how it really goes down. And it's so startling. This story, I have to tell chronologically. Let me start off with, I was watching a movie called Hypernormalization. It's on YouTube. It's by Adam Curtis. I found it fascinating. I really enjoyed watching it. One of the things that I learned was the information that Adam Curtis mentioned about the bombing of Lockerbie, because the implication we know today is that the Libyan secret intelligence planned a bomb. However, Adam Curtis mentioned in Hypernormalization that the bombing was likely not from Libya, but likely from Iranian or Syrian or another group from the Middle East. And he cited a story that I actually haven't really heard often discussed in the United States, but the shooting down of Iranian Air Flight 655, July 3rd, 1988. USS Vonset. He's actually doesn't know it at the time, but believe it was actually in Iranian waters, shoots down a plane, kills 280 people, roughly. The assumption made by Adam Curtis was that this was the trigger for the Lockerbie bombing. And this is so fascinating, is how Libya is again involved in corruption of a leader that a lot of people look at and see and think, he did a great job, they all like him, and it's Tony Blair. It's the third way, Tony Blair. But when you dig in behind the scenes about what Tony Blair did involving Libya, things get really dark very quick, and it shouldn't be surprising. To me, the reason why I like talking about and thinking about this is I like asking myself, what is the biggest difference between democracies and dictatorships? I think the distinction that people want to make today is that in democracies, there's the rule of law, you get to elect leaders, and other countries you don't, and that's true. However, in a world where there are dictatorships and democracies, democratic leaders act behind the scenes with dictators and do some dirty and nasty things. In that world, the politicians are caring about money and the economy and jobs. So I bring up that story about Iran because it's how I got into examining this story about Libya, and to say, wow, okay, so Lockerbie was caused by the Libyans. Now, the story is that after the war of Iraq, Qaddafi reaches out to leaders in the West and wants to give up his weapons of mass destruction. However, he has certain demands in giving that up. He sends those demands to MI6 in the UK, and there are 5 stipulations. Now, here's the thing. One of them is believed to be the capture of Abdel Hakim Belhaj. And documents show that MI6, Mark Allen, helped the Libyans find them. It's part of an agreement of giving up your weapons of mass destruction will help. You're going to give up your oil fields to British Petroleum, BP, and we'll find your political enemy for you. It's like being hired, really, to be we're a more powerful intelligence agency. You have enemies? Great, we love your oil. See, it's a beautiful exchange, isn't it? It is insane what happens. So essentially, Abdel Belhaj is then captured, rendered to Tripoli. Now, look, I'm not at all saying that this person was a saint. However, it shows the extent of how oil can influence and corrupt politicians. in democracies. As I talked about in my previous episode about France, this one's about Great Britain. And the fascinating thing, and the reason why I'm talking about this, it seems to always come back to Libya. Libya is the country where so much corruption emanates from. It's amazing. It's so amazing. So they capture Abdel Belhaj. They render him from Malaysia to Bangkok, to then a prison in Libya where he stays 6-7 years, is tortured, and eventually begins a process of suing the British government and specifically the MI6. And that should tell you just so much about the extent the British officials were willing to help Libyan dictator during this period of improved relations between Libya and Great Britain. And so here's the thing that nobody expected. Because this was all happening behind the scene, after the Libyan government collapsed in 2011, 2012, we then began to see actual documents and proof. And here is Alan, MI6 counterterrorism chief, telling the head of Qaddafi's intelligence, Musa Kusa, I congratulate you on the safe arrival of Belhaj. This was the least we could do for you and for Libya to demonstrate the remarkable relationship we've built over recent years. Now again, Libya was claiming this guy is a terrorist involved in terrorist groups and he's a terrorist, and so bring him to us. Of course, people wanted to go in and see just how well connected he is. Interestingly, if you were willing to do that, nobody asked Qaddafi questions about, well, you're a dictator. Do we trust you? Do we trust the word that a dictator just says, hey, that's one of my political enemies? Because I think what a big fault line is, one of the biggest fault lines in politics is, how will you govern? That's what really defines it. One of them is, will you be pro-privatization, pro-investment, pro-corporate financing from the West? If yes, they'll overlook some of your more brutal repression of the domestic opposition, right? That makes sense in describing how politics is played today. It is less about the fact that you are a dictator or you believe in dictatorship or that you are a dictator. It's more about what type of dictator are you? Are you one that's willing to play ball? Are you one that's willing to agree to allow British capital to move in? Hey, that is the way British companies get to grow their stocks, their investments. They get to make more money. So part of the agreement for the West, in order to remove the sanctions going back to 2003, 2004 with Qaddafi, is that he had to give over intelligence officers of Libya to be tried for the Lockerbie bombing, which happened, by the way, roughly 6 months after the Iranian plane that I mentioned was shot down. That's what Adam Curtis mentioned, and I just wanted to go and research that story. So, plane blows up over Lockerbie, Scotland. I think it was 198 Americans died. I think the vast majority were Americans. The plane was to New York from London. So Libya complied and handed over 2 persons. And so Libya hands over Migari. And here's the interesting thing. There are 2 people handed over. Migari is sentenced for the bombing, but the co-defendant is found not guilty and released. So only Migari planned the attack, or did the attack, which I think most people who looked into the Lockerbie bombing realize there had to be many more people involved, but this was never discussed with Libya, how far, what extent. And of course, the Libyans denied Migari. As far as I've realized in the research I've done, is that he denies ever doing it. In some ways, he was the sacrificial lamb. In order to remove the sanctions, the compensation had to be, hey, we need 2 of your officials. So here's the thing. He spends a few years in jail, and then 2 things happen behind the scenes. BP confesses to pressuring the government to do a prisoner transfer agreement. And says that the reason for this is they don't want any damages to their commercial interests and to affect the nearly £1 billion of offshore drilling in the region near Libya. BP pressuring the politicians and government to release Migari from jail. And so what did the Scottish authorities that had control over him say? Well, he's going to die in 3 months. He has prostate cancer. He actually lived for another 3 years. So they release him on compassionate release. He goes back to Libya. And that is it. If people think that that's crazy, what I'm saying is that a corporation is willing to have that much influence over politicians. In the United States, Mrs. Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, Foreign Relations, Barbara Boxer, Dianne Feinstein, the Democrats, all talking about this, that commercial interests would be put above acts of terror and the deaths of victims in the terrorist attack over Lockerbie, Scotland. Just shows the extent and the pull that politicians and corporate, which I'm saying nothing new. I don't think anybody listening is probably surprised by the fact I'm all saying this. But even when people die, that's how dark it can get. And when Trump talked about the Saudi journalist being killed, and there was a lot of pressure put on Trump to punish Saudi Arabia, and Trump's response in many ways was, well, I have a bunch of business deals, and most people's reactions, which was my reaction, was you're willing to put money, lives, investments over people, over a person's life, a person who was a journalist. And he was completely comfortable with that, of course. That's not surprising, but the extent is the brutal honesty of that statement in some ways. It's so shocking, it's disgusting and vile. And yet that is the way British politics, American politics works in many ways. The United States and the UK are willing to tolerate a certain level of brutality if it means you're creating jobs or selling oil at a discounted rate or cheap rate, and there's good investments and oil companies are doing well. There has to be a way out of oil. And I wonder what the consequences for the world would be without having countries producing oil or completely energy free. Imagine what the geopolitics of that would be. A lot of countries whose revenue depend on oil, what would they be selling and trading? That's the key question. It's probably why Saudi Arabia is diversifying in renewable energies and tourism and other sectors, because the day will come in the lifetime of a lot of people listening that this is going to happen in the next few decades. 10, 20 years. It is so shocking to me just to see the extent of BP influencing Tony Blair and the Scottish government to release a Libyan convicted of blowing up an airplane over Lockerbie, Scotland, and sent back to Libya. Oh, he's going to die anyway, so they release him, which, okay, the company BP had that much pull because, not because it thought, well, hey, it's compassionate release or, we need to be, no, it wanted to protect its own commercial interests involved in that. So, and yet I bring it up because I'm trying to connect all of these dots and they're everywhere. It's striking the extent of even people's lives have a price and a value, huh? You can't put a price on a life. Oh, I think people do and can and have. And it's truly just shocking how it is. So again, I'm not at all saying that I'm not saying that the Libyans did it. I think that that's what people's consensus is currently. However, many other people believe that the Libyan attacks didn't actually happen by the Libyans, but it was actually the Iranians or another group connected to Iran, financed by Syria. It's incredible how these dots are all connected, but it just shows you the extent that Britain was willing to work with Qaddafi, find his enemies anywhere around the world, send them back to be tortured in Libyan prison. I have to say, there is international law. There are domestic laws. People who do this can be tried, should be tried. The fact that people aren't tried because it could hurt national security. And so currently, people aren't being prosecuted because, and this is in Britain, court system in Britain saying, well, we can't try this person because it would damage national interest and national security. So there you have it. You get away with it if it's national security and a national interest. That, to me, is going to change in the future. It has to change. People can't get away with these type of blatant violations of the law. And of course, when it comes to oil, money, politics, is so dirty. Oil corruption is so ingrained in politics. If you're rich and powerful because you have money, mean, I could basically predict the future in this episode too. North Korea, the day they give up their weapon and want to grow their economy, mining companies will already be in Pyongyang, but there will be a major rush of investments, certainly much larger than we currently see today. Why? Because the mining interest and mining investments all throughout North Korea, which haven't been explored, and if the rest of the world has already been explored, then we think, hey, then North Korea might be one of the last countries to allow mining interests to be explored. It's so dirty. Politics is just, this is why people don't like talking about politics. Because again, politicians will build a story to tell you, no, this isn't true. These are exaggerations. We never did this. BP will deny it. There will always be a denial. Always deny, deny, deny. But I think politics is changing in this era, especially with technology and the internet and the ability to find these stories and to make these connections and dots to how corrupt things are. Even in countries that claim to uphold human rights, rule of law, justice, democracy, are easily corrupted. Sarkozy, like I talked about, had the connections with Qaddafi, financing his campaigns, presidential campaign allegedly. Britain, BP pressuring, Qaddafi making demands, Britain complying, even willing to give up a person convicted of committing a terrorist attack, willing to send them back to Libya, all to protect oil interests. And yeah, there are so many more of these stories, I'm sure. And look, I'm talking about France and Britain and the United States. I can only imagine how many of these stories there are that I could talk about Iran in 1953. It's so many other stories that I hope to talk about in the future. But right now, this isn't corruption in politics and how oil money leads to very dirty behind the room backdoor deals is so, despite what people see between the United States and Trump, this is very common around the world. Or the United States trying to influence the overthrow of Maduro and Venezuela. I'm making these episodes and connections to show, look, this isn't the only United States. This is a global phenomenon. This happens in many other countries. So in this example, Qaddafi willing to work with the UK, creating up this relationship, Blair willing to overlook his brutal crackdown on dissidents, on enemies, willing to help find Qaddafi's enemies anywhere around the world, returned them to Libya. They knew they were going to get tortured. Claims that, no, we had assurances from Libyan authorities that they wouldn't is bullshit, and everybody knows it. Nobody's that stupid. But that's how nasty politics gets. And then the fact that a Libyan Migari is imprisoned in the UK, then pressured by BP in order to maintain oil contracts. Tony Blair presses on the Scottish government. The Scottish government, under pressure as well, releases the person back to Libya. Makes me think, is politics even be our primary focus? Should it be just a conversation about economics and the economy, and that the economy dominates politics? Money dominates politics. They love to talk about, well, what's happening in the political world? Shouldn't we be asking the questions, who's financing who, where is the money flowing to? Money is the corrosive influence in politics, which I think most people realize and know. Both corporate money, private money, individuals donating, but corporations with their financial interests, and to claim to politicians, hey, if you don't help us with this, we're not going to have jobs, which is why politicians are willing to oftentimes agree with oil companies and to do whatever bidding they need to do because they want to secure jobs, which is the same thing that Trump said about the Khashoggi's murder in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. I got to protect the jobs. American jobs, a lot of jobs. And imagine the chilling effect this has on journalists willing to risk their lives, to write stories, to investigate, to meet people, to uncover the corruption. The corruption is everywhere and in front of us. Corruption is everywhere. Corruption is in front of us. Corruption is in all factors of politics, in democracies and dictatorships and everything else in between. It's the sort of form of corruption is really the distinguishing factor. Democracies are willing to have these relationships behind the scenes with dictatorships. Then is democracy just a front? Is it just hey, I want to look respectable and democratic and appealing, but really the money behind the scenes is what funds politics. And then people wonder why we're cynical about politics. Then politicians are like, don't stay cynical, believe in the system, believe in this. How can you when you know that money behind the scenes is actually influencing the decisions that politicians make? Right? I mean, this all goes back to money and politics. Now, before I end this episode, I'm going to read to you a conversation that Qaddafi and Tony Blair have together. Yes. Just going to read this really quick conversation they had. This is, to put it in context, this is during the Arab Spring. There's fighting going on in Libya, and Tony Blair is helping his buddy Qaddafi. His buddy, who he thought would be a modernizer, was going to privatize. And so this is the actual conversation they had on the phone together. Tony Blair, spoken to people, absolute key thing is the bloodshed and violence must stop. Qaddafi, who said that? 100% nothing is happening. Tony Blair, there are reports that they're on the news. Let me explain, because I have talked to people. Everybody wants a peaceful end to this. Gaddafi's response is, no fighting at all in Libya. Who said that? They want some. It's a campaign of colonialization. We have to defy the colonization. There's nothing here. No fight, no blood. Come to Tripoli to see everything here. Tony Blair, the belief is that there's fighting going on, and if you have a safe place to go, you should go there, because this will not end peacefully, and there has to be a process of change. That process of change can be managed, and we have to find a way of managing it. Absolutely. Absolutely. You've been managing it for a long time behind the scenes. It seems that this is colonization, Qaddafi said. I will have to arm the people and get ready for a fight. So it continues on like that. And Qaddafi then says some interesting things. So Qaddafi is also a person not in touch with reality, oftentimes. He says to Tony Blair, there's no bloodshed here. It's very quiet. And if you want to reap Libya, we're ready to fight it. It will be like Iraq. Why don't you come and see Tripoli? And Tony Blair is saying, no, we don't want to recolonize Libya. Libya is for its people. Qaddafi goes, leave us alone. If you want to see Libya TV and see the demos supporting us, TV show size, we now know how to sort it out. Qaddafi then puts the phone to the television. Said, there's no fighting. There are no demonstrations. Long live Qaddafi, the child is shouting. Oh my goodness. So then Tony Blair is then told by Qaddafi, there is fighting in Algeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Are you supporting terrorism? See, I think some people on the right, when they say Democrats or the people on the left were supporting terrorism, I think what they're implying or referring to is the fact that some of the opposition groups were Islamic groups that were fighting the governments. I believe that every government that fell during the Arab Spring was a secular dictatorship. So none of them were monarchies. So that's interesting in the sense that a lot of the opposition groups that have been repressed by these dictatorships were Islamic groups. That doesn't mean they're all Al-Qaeda. But of course, Qaddafi doesn't care. Tony Blair's response to being asked, are you supporting terrorism? We completely oppose to terrorism and Al-Qaeda. The only way out is to allow constitutional change process to take place now. The constitutional change process takes place now. The Al-Qaeda elements are not for change, Qaddafi says. This is not their demand. These are kids. No one is talking about constitutional change. And so it basically continues on like this. Yeah, this other lesson I think in politics that we should always remember is that there are bad guys, and many ways the people who oppose bad guys are often bad guys themselves. We want to believe that those who oppose the bad guys in power are the good guys, but oftentimes it's bad guys. It's a different form of bad guys, a different type of bad guys. And again, overthrowing Gaddafi, people were smiling and happy and saying, things are going to be so much better. Oh, everything's going to be great. But a new set of bad guys comes in, competes for power, fights for power. And now there's a major power struggle, leaving the country in a brutal civil war, killed it must be hundreds of thousands of people by now. And that's what you have. You then have a destruction of a country. Oil interests must hire private security firms to go and produce the oil. There's now a country essentially falling apart. There's lack of security. There's violence. The infrastructure has collapsed. And all for what? To gain what? Is life better? I don't know. If you look at it from a perspective of people opposing Qaddafi, yeah, life's better. If you look at it, the average person who wasn't involved in politics, who just went about their day, going to work, coming back home, making money, life in many ways is probably worse. Yeah, there's no Qaddafi, but there's a new form of dictatorship in the country, or violence, or there's a new military, or a new authority that has come about that may be as brutal or worse than Qaddafi. So there you have it. It's never a beautiful project. We want to say that, yes, this new leadership that removed the dictatorship will come in and sweep away things and things will be beautiful. Doesn't always end that way. Sometimes it might, but it doesn't always. And most likely it might not. Again, it requires one group of people to take over a country. They oftentimes don't have the support of the locals. And then this country divided regionally, split by tribes. And so there you have it. Libya is now fighting a war much like in Afghanistan and other countries in Central Asia and the Middle East. That about how corrupt it is. Qaddafi, when he was calling Tony Blair, I forgot to mention this, he said that the organization in Libya was called Al-Qaeda Organization in North Africa. They were being run by somebody in Guantanamo, and he was trying to sell to Tony Blair and the West that he was fighting this war on terror, that this was like the Al-Qaeda groups in Libya, which, again, there's some truth to that. Dictators don't always lie. It's not as simple as, yes, he's a brutal dictator who represses people, but in certain situations, truth might come out. And I mean, I won't say that all of the opposition forces were that, but clearly some were. But I wanted to do this episode to just say, this is how a country, Britain, that I follow politics very closely. I enjoy reading politics, but oftentimes the connections to dictatorships and leaders is so corrosive, so destructive to the rule of law, to what really happens. I mean, people's distrust in politics, then politicians wonder why people don't trust politicians, why they're cynical. You're releasing a person because a corporation put pressure on you to do that. You're releasing a person from jail to another country because British Petroleum asked you to do that. British Petroleum, their oil interests are more important than the lives lost. And they won't say that because it's not good PR, but that's essentially what they're implying, is to say, look, this person's in jail. Why don't we release him? He's already spent a couple of years in jail. He paid his price. We need to secure oil interests, because if we don't, British people are going to suffer. They won't have oil. Company stock won't do as well. We'll lose jobs. That is the politics that is going on today. And again, the French, no different. It's terrifying reality that I'm sure a lot of people knew. I don't know if people knew the details that I was mentioning here, connecting all of these dots in politics in Great Britain to Libya, but it is a reality of that Libya in politics is impacting many countries, even beyond the United States. I found it interesting that the NATO led the attacks against Libya. It was Europe, Western Europe, that led these attacks, not the United States. Great Britain was involved in it as well. So they got the deals, they got the oil funding. Then when Qaddafi could go, they were hoping to build a new politics in it. And it seemed like Tony Blair was trying to keep his contact friend. Tony Blair was willing to try to keep Qaddafi alive and to try to manage a peaceful situation out of this. But I like reading and seeing what people actually say behind the scenes, because what they tell us in public obviously is a managed story. But seeing how the actual politicians are thinking, how they're acting, and what they want to do, I think sheds light in politics. And I'm sure, look, the real shady things is, again, the money and corporate influence. You can change it. Can you change it? If you decide to be a politician, who says that there won't be a corporate interest there pressuring you to do certain things that you know are morally wrong, corrupt, unethical, criminal, right? And then people wonder why people are cynical about politics. And this is just one example that I brought up today. There are many examples throughout every country of the world that I could talk about. So yeah, that's Collateral Banter. Being a little cynical today, but I don't care. I will continue making episodes, but I will move on from corruption and oil in Libya, because there's just more stories that I want to tell. I'm going to do a couple interviews with friends. Well, hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. Collateral Banter. We'll be back again. This is your host, Danny T. Take care. Peace.